Well, I'm Charles Nilon, or Charlie Nilon, and I'm a wildlife biologist. And to many people, that's a strange kind of thing for a reason that we'll talk about shortly. Other people say I'm an urban wildlife biologist, which, if you're a wildlife biologist, is a strange kind of thing. So I combine two strange kinds of things in how I look at the world. But basically, I do what I do because I never got out of the stage of liking seeing animals around my house. Now, in Colombia, we pride ourselves on the things we've done for conservation. We talk about preserving the MKT Nature and Fitness Trail and the buffer areas adjacent to it. We talk about Eagle Bluffs. We talk about Rockbridge State Park. But one of the things that we often don't think about is that most people's experience with wildlife and their exposure to wildlife is what they see day to day. So starting about 10 years ago, I worked with a graduate student, Donna Brunet, on a project to try to understand how people and their activities impact wildlife. We looked at butterflies, and we looked at yards, about 60 yards around Columbia, and looked at the kinds of species, butterfly species, that were associated with plants. And we have this nice graph here, which you can't really see, but the top line tells you that because it has this nice leveling off effect, that tells you that if you're a butterfly in Columbia, that's great. Because if you look at a sample of 35 yards around the city, you probably capture about 90% of the butterfly species that occur in the city. But we found that the people who we studied and who volunteered for that project look like that paper. They're mostly white. Now, this group of folks are people with a group called Urbio, which is a research group that tries to look at urban biodiversity and design. And they're interested particularly in the role that culture and poverty and things play in that. So we decided to look at Columbia, and you'll see in this map of Columbia there's some colors. And if you look at the turquoise, which we often call the first ward, that's a different color than the yellow and a different color than the green. And those are all residential areas that differ in the kind of pattern of people's yards. So we started thinking maybe there's a relationship between socioeconomic data and the pattern of people's yards, what kind of plants and animals they see around their houses. So this map says that inner city area that we often call the first ward is different, and it has more black people and more poor people than other areas in Columbia do. So we decided we wanted to see if there's a pattern that's associated with that, with what people see in their yards and so on. And we also did an actual study to show that, yes, statistically speaking, there is a 95% probability that those yards are different. So, in other words, the center of Columbia is different from the southwest part of Columbia. Now, to do this in a more practical way, we did a project that we started in Washington, D.C. with a colleague named George Middendorf, who looks at a socioeconomic gradient and looks at trees and vegetation as you walk along T Street in Washington, D.C. And he found that as you go from a wealthy neighborhood to a poor neighborhood, there's a big change. And he also found that as the area gentrified, the vegetation changed back. So we decided to look at this in Columbia. And I go out with my class and also as a research project, and we look at a transect along Edgewood Avenue from Redbud Lane to the corner of Aldea and Alexander and Worley, which is the same street but two name changes. And as you start walking along Edgewood, you'll see that on a nice winter day in January, there's a sort of cathedral effect of trees. And the areas adjacent to those houses have big yards, lots and lots of open space. There are little creeks behind the houses. We see deer in people's yards. You see lots of places for birds and rabbits and squirrels and foxes and bobcats and all kinds of things. But at the other end of the street, when you get toward Alexander and Worley, you see a change. You see there are no big trees. There's not all that nice open space next to it, and you don't see as much habitat for deer and some other things like that. So we began to try to study what were the actual patterns among these neighborhoods. And we found that if you look at areas in the central part of the city in particular, you see that we saw that pattern we just saw where there are fewer trees in the yard. But we found there's something else going on. If you look at these places and look in the backyards and the side yards, you're going to see that they still retain a lot of the features of an agricultural landscape like a lot of Columbia used to look like. You see old fence rows, you see trees growing up in groups, you see squirrel nests, you see lots of things going on there. So we began to see that these neighborhoods aren't just depauperate places or places absent, but they're a different pattern than what you might see in other places in Columbia, which might suggest that what we often think of as a deprived neighborhood maybe is not that deprived. Then if you look at places which on southwest Columbia, like this area in Princeton across from Kiwanis Park, where you go back to that pattern of having lots of open space and lots of trees, you see a different pattern, maybe different groups of species. So we've started to look at things like what kinds of species actually use these places. And we found that if you live in the central part of Columbia, which has old fence rows and habitats that are very much like open Missouri farmlands and woodlands, you see things like fox squirrels. You don't see anywhere else in the city. I tell my class these are not red squirrels, these are fox squirrels. So you can go home tonight and impress your friend and say these are fox squirrels. Okay. Then the other thing that we're looking at is we're looking at how do you actually engage people in wildlife. We have a grant with the university funded by National Science Foundation to look at how do you engage people in nature. And we work with a group of students, or worked with a group of students, on how you do outreach and how you engage people in learning about their neighborhoods and learning about ecology. And we found that you can inform people in any neighborhood in Columbia about what's there. These are a group of bird species that we found in the late winter, early spring in some neighborhoods in the African American part of Columbia. And this, nothing really spectacular about this, but it's simply saying there are birds, and we often think there aren't birds. So what we're doing also is we're trying to get kids to understand that who you are and what you can look at and those kind of things aren't based on aren't based on where you live, and that you can live in Columbia's first ward or live in the inner city area and be engaged in wildlife and have fun in the creek and play around and see lots of animals and tadpoles and fishes and things like that, and become engaged in your local neighborhood and wonder about what kinds of things live around your house and try to protect those things and go on to become a wildlife biologist or a forester or just a good citizen who's engaged in their neighborhood. Thank you.